Ever taste a meal that felt like it came straight from your grandparents' hands? Those lost hillbilly dinners were simple, smoky, and made with heart, not money. What did we lose when food stopped telling stories like that? Soup beans and fatback were more than supper. They were the week's anchor. The pot would simmer all day on the stove, filling the cabin with that smoky, familiar scent of slow-cooked beans and pork fat. Fatback, a cheap cut from the back of a hog, gave those beans their flavor and a bit of grease for strength. In the Appalachian Hills, this was a one-pot wonder that worked hard for families who worked harder. You could ladle it over cornbread, stretch it with onions or greens, and feed everyone until Saturday. There was pride in scraping that pot clean, because it meant you got through another week without wasting a thing. Each scoop was proof that simple food could keep you full and happy without costing much more than time. Some say it tasted like home itself, the kind of comfort no restaurant can serve. Those old soup beans told the story of mountain thrift and heart in every bite. Fried cabbage and onions was the meal that turned scraps into a feast. You started with whatever you had: a small head of cabbage, a tired onion, and the last spoonful of bacon grease from breakfast. Toss it all into a cast iron skillet and let it fry until the edges browned and the smell filled the house. There was no recipe written down, just instinct and a good ear for the sound of sizzling vegetables. This dinner showed what made hillfolk cooking special: the ability to turn nothing into something worth sitting down for. It was hearty, smoky, and comforting, the kind of dish that could hush an empty stomach and still leave leftovers for breakfast. Paired with a hunk of cornbread or a slice of salt pork, it reminded everyone that flavor did not come from money. It came from patience. Sometimes the simplest meals were the ones that made life feel rich. Cornbread and milk supper was what families ate when the pantry was nearly bare. A leftover wedge of cornbread crumbled into a bowl, covered with cold milk or tangy buttermilk, became dinner without complaint. It was cool and soft, with just enough salt and sweetness to feel like comfort. Hillfolk did not see this as poor eating. They saw it as good sense. Every crumb mattered. Every drop of milk earned its keep. On hot summer nights, this meal kept folks full without firing up the stove again. It carried the quiet rhythm of old kitchens, simple, clean, and made from what you had. Some would drizzle a little molasses over top or sprinkle sugar if they had extra. Kids slurped it down, while elders remembered the hard times that taught them gratitude. Cornbread and milk supper was proof that even in scarcity, there was dignity, taste, and the kind of peace that only home-cooked food could bring. Fried salt pork with gravy was the kind of meal that stuck to your bones and made you thankful for every bite. Salt pork was cheap and cured, tough until you fried it just right in a black skillet. Once it crisped, the leftover drippings turned into gold, stirred with flour and milk to make creamy white gravy that poured like silk. It covered biscuits, potatoes, or anything else that needed saving from plainness. For mountain folks, this dish turned poverty into pleasure. It filled bellies after long days in the fields and made Sunday mornings smell like grace. Salt pork was often the only meat on the table, but with that gravy, no one minded. The taste was bold, smoky, and honest, like the people who made it. A plate of fried salt pork reminded everyone that ingenuity could feed a family when the cupboard said otherwise. It was poor man's steak with rich man's flavor. Ramps and eggs were spring's homecoming song in the hills. Ramps, those wild mountain onions with a kick sharp enough to make your eyes water, came up when winter loosened its grip. Folks foraged them along shady slopes, carrying bunches home like treasure. Fried in bacon grease, they turned golden and fragrant, and when you cracked eggs over them, the skillet became a celebration of survival. After months of salted meats and dried beans, this meal tasted alive again. The air filled with that pungent scent only mountain people could love. It was quick to make, rich in flavor, and a sure sign that better weather had arrived. Ramps and eggs reminded everyone that the land still provided if you knew where to look. That first bite after the thaw was like breathing again, spicy, hearty, and filled with gratitude for another season of life in the Appalachian Hills. Squirrel stew was born from the woods, not the market. A family that could bring down a squirrel had meat enough for the pot, and that was reason to be thankful. Dressed, chopped, and simmered with onions, potatoes, and carrots, it became a thick, rich stew that smelled like Sunday comfort. No one thought twice about it. Hunting was just part of living. The flavor was earthy and wild, something that no city meal could imitate. Children learned early that nothing caught went to waste, and every bite carried the story of skill and effort. When times were lean, squirrel stew brought warmth, protein, and pride. It was not fancy, but it was honest and filling, the kind of food that fed both body and spirit. Around the table, folks shared not just supper, but the satisfaction of making something good from the land itself. Soup bone and potato hash was what happened when thrift met hunger. After a long week, that old soup bone still had work to do. It went back into the pot for one more boil, drawing out every ounce of flavor left in it. Then you would toss in diced potatoes, onions, maybe a carrot if you were lucky, and fry it all together until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with promise, even when there was not much else to eat. Mountain cooking was about stretching what you had until it could not stretch anymore. This hash tasted smoky, salty, and satisfying. Nothing fancy, just real food made by real hands. Families knew that wasting even a scrap was a sin against hard work. Soup bone and potato hash proved that resourcefulness could taste every bit as good as abundance when cooked with patience and pride. Poke salad greens were one of those dishes that demanded both courage and care. Pokeweed grew wild and fast, but it could turn dangerous if you did not boil it just right. Still, folks learned how to tame it. After boiling and rinsing it several times, they would fry it in bacon grease until tender and smoky. It became a side dish with real backbone, a plate full of green proof that mountain people could make a meal out of almost anything. Every bite carried a hint of the wild earth it came from. Eating poke salad was an act of both survival and defiance, a way to say, "We will eat well, even when the cupboard's empty." Served with cornbread or salt pork, it fed families through hard months when gardens were thin. In every community that made it, poke salad greens stood for resilience, bravery, and the genius of hungry folks who refused to go without. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the sound of supper sizzling in a skillet. Cornmeal, water, salt, and a little grease were all you needed to turn a handful of nothing into a golden brown meal. Hillbilly kitchens loved this trick because it was fast, cheap, and never disappointed. You would drop spoonfuls of batter into the pan, listen for that familiar hiss, and wait for the edges to crisp. Hoe cakes were bread, but they were also pride, a way to make the table feel full even when meat was missing. They paired with beans, greens, and gravy, soaking up every last bit of flavor. No fork was needed, just hands and hunger. The smell alone could stop anyone passing by. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the mountain version of comfort food, simple fried perfection that spoke louder than any recipe ever could. They were proof that flavor comes from fire, patience, and heart. Rabbit and dumplings was a meal that tasted like effort and reward mixed together, the kind that carried the story of the hunt straight to the supper table. Catching the rabbit was only half the work. The rest was done slow and steady in the kitchen. The meat was browned, simmered in broth until tender, and dropped into bubbling stock where floury dumplings waited to soak up every drop of flavor. Steam fogged the windows while the smell drifted through the house, wrapping around everyone like a promise of comfort. It was gamey, rich, and deeply satisfying, an old-world supper that turned survival into celebration. Every bite reminded folks that food earned by hand carried a different kind of pride. Families would sit quiet except for the clink of spoons and soft hums of contentment. Rabbit and dumplings filled bellies and hearts alike, warming even the coldest nights. It was country comfort at its finest, built from grit, gratitude, and a little wild luck. In mountain homes, it stood as proof that patience and hard work always paid off. The meal may have been humble, but the feeling it brought was priceless. Home, warmth, and a kind of joy you could only taste. cabbage and ham hock soup was the kind of dinner that filled both bellies and souls when times were thin and money ran out. The hock, tough and bony but rich with hidden flavor, simmered for hours until the meat fell away and the broth turned smoky. Chopped cabbage leaves, onions, and potatoes joined the pot, soaking up the taste that only slow cooking and patience could bring. The kitchen filled with steam and scent, proof that comfort was brewing even without much to spare. It was not fancy, but it fed families for days and cost next to nothing. In mountain kitchens, the secret was never waste. It was making do and making magic from scraps. The sound of the spoon scraping the pot was the sound of gratitude itself. Every bowl carried the story of thrift and resilience. A steaming ladle served on a cold evening felt like victory over hardship. Even with little meat, the broth was rich, the cabbage sweet, and the memory lasting. Ham hock soup reminded everyone that love and labor make the best seasoning of all. It was humble food, but it held more comfort than gold ever could. Fried green tomatoes with cornmeal crust were the South's way of saying waste nothing, because even an unripe tomato could still shine. When the vines hung heavy with fruit that would not turn red in time, thrifty hands sliced them thick, dusted them in cornmeal, and dropped them into sizzling bacon grease. The kitchen came alive with that familiar pop and crackle, the sound of hunger about to be satisfied. The slices fried golden and crisp, tart inside and smoky outside, a perfect blend of garden freshness and skillet comfort. They were often served beside beans, greens, or gravy, completing a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like plenty. Each bite carried the flavor of hard work, sunshine, and summer's patience. Mothers never measured. They just knew when the batter was right, and kids learned to flip them when the edges turned brown. Fried green tomatoes were proof that nothing in the South went to waste. Not time, not food, not love. They were simple, dependable, and unforgettable. The first bite snapped with tang. The last ended in quiet satisfaction. In every kitchen that made them, thrift became art, and every plate told the same story. Make do and make it delicious. Beans and taters were what kept mountain families going when there was little else to count on, the kind of meal that stretched far and satisfied deep. Pinto beans simmered low and long, softening with salt, fatback, or even just water when meat was short. Meanwhile, potatoes waited nearby, boiled, mashed, or fried crisp, to turn a pot of beans into a full supper. Together, they made a plate that felt heavier than hunger and warmer than hardship. The beans brought body, the potatoes brought comfort, and the combination brought peace after long days. Mountain folks never needed fancy seasonings or sides. They just needed food that filled and soothed. Children knew the smell of beans simmering before they even came through the door. It was the smell of stability, of knowing you would eat, even in hard years. Beans and taters taught patience, gratitude, and the quiet pride that comes from surviving together. It was more than supper. It was a ritual that reminded families what mattered. Every forkful told the same story. Work hard, share what you have, and be thankful for enough. It was food for living, not showing off, and no one ever left hungry. Chicken and slick dumplings were the mountain way of turning one bird into a feast that fed everyone around the table. A single chicken simmered down into a rich broth that filled the house with the smell of Sunday comfort. Thin dumplings rolled by hand-replaced fancy noodles, soaking up every drop of flavor and thickening the stew into a creamy, heartwarming dish. The bits of tender chicken floated among the slick dumplings like treasure pieces in gravy. This was not a meal of plenty, but one of patience, pride, and clever hands. Appalachian cooks knew how to stretch what they had until it felt like abundance. Steam rose from the pot like a promise that no one would go hungry tonight. Every bowl felt earned, heavy, and satisfying in the way only home cooking can be. The leftovers, if any, tasted richer by morning. Chicken and slick dumplings turned scarcity into celebration, hardship into comfort, and hunger into harmony. It was food for body and soul alike. Even today, that first spoonful carries the same truth. It does not take much to make a meal worth remembering when it is made with care and love. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor man's steak, but no one eating them ever complained because they hit every craving just right. Thick pink slices of bologna slapped down on a hot iron skillet and sizzled until the edges curled like little cups, blistering enough to draw out that smoky, salty bite everyone loved. The smell alone could make an empty kitchen feel full. Add a swipe of yellow mustard, a slice of onion, and 2 soft pieces of white bread, and you had a meal that worked for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was cheap, fast, and always satisfying. Kids carried them in brown paper bags to school, and grown men packed them for long days in fields, mines, or mills. In the hills, fried bologna sandwiches were as dependable as sunrise, simple proof that flavor never depended on price. The grease soaked through napkins, but no one minded. It was comfort food at its best. When money was thin, this sandwich filled both belly and spirit, turning hard times into something a little easier to swallow. It was fried, humble, and proud, a true taste of mountain living that never needed dressing up to feel right. Molasses glazed ham scraps were the second act for leftovers that never went to waste, a way of turning thrift into pure delight. Bits of ham saved from Sunday dinner were brushed with thick, dark molasses and crisped in a skillet until their edges sizzled and caramelized. The glaze turned ordinary scraps glossy and rich, sweet meeting salt in a perfect mountain harmony. It might have been a meal made from leftovers, but it smelled like something meant for celebration. Served with hot biscuits, wilted greens, or mashed taters, it was enough to make a small kitchen feel abundant again. Folks in the hills did not waste a thing. They reused every bite, every drop, and every ounce of effort. The sound of that sizzling pan was music to anyone who worked for their food. Each piece of glazed ham carried more than flavor. It carried gratitude. The molasses softened the salty edges, creating a sticky sweetness that felt like kindness on a plate. It was living proof that a meal could be poor in ingredients yet rich in spirit. In every bite was a memory of hard work turned to reward, and no one ever left hungry. Fried apples and biscuits made kitchens smell like home long before the word comfort food existed. Dried apples were soaked and stewed with butter, sugar, and a sprinkle of cinnamon until they turned glossy and golden in the pan. The mixture bubbled low and slow, thick enough to cling to a spoon but soft enough to melt on the tongue. When spooned over warm biscuits split straight from the oven, the syrup soaked down deep into the crumb. It was part breakfast, part dessert, and all memory. Families made it on cool mornings when the stove burned early, using whatever fruit they had dried the summer before. The smell filled every corner of the house, bringing even sleepy children to the table before the first call. For some, this dish was sweeter than candy. For others, it was a reminder of simpler days when love was measured in full plates and clean pans. Fried apples and biscuits proved that comfort did not come from riches, but from the warmth of what was already there. Every spoonful was proof that sweetness could come from scarcity, and joy could come from nothing more than a hot biscuit. Cornmeal mush with drippings was the ultimate proof that Appalachian cooks could turn yesterday's leftovers into today's comfort. First, you stirred cornmeal into salted water until it thickened into a firm porridge, poured it into pans, and let it cool overnight. The next morning, those firm slabs were sliced and fried in hot bacon grease until the edges crisped brown and the centers stayed creamy and soft. The smell alone was enough to pull folks from their beds, as rich and tempting as any feast. Poured over with white gravy or syrup, it became a breakfast fit for a hard day's work. Families who had little knew how to stretch every grain, every drop of grease, and every bit of effort. The crackle from the skillet told them they had done it right. Cornmeal mush with drippings was more than a meal. It was a quiet triumph. It fed the body and reminded the heart that nothing had gone to waste. Each bite tasted like patience, creativity, and pride, the kind only born from making do. What began as simple porridge became a golden slice of home that fed generations through thick and thin. Possum and sweet potatoes was the kind of backwoods dinner that kept families fed through the leanest winters. When hunting was luck and store meat was too dear, possum became fair game, slow roasted in the hearth until tender and rich. Paired with syrupy baked sweet potatoes, The dish filled the kitchen with a deep, smoky aroma that wrapped around every soul inside. The meat's wild flavor was softened by the caramel sweetness of the potatoes, balancing the meal just right. No one cooked it for show. It was made from necessity and served with pride. In those hills, feeding your family meant using what the woods offered without apology or waste. Preparing it took skill, patience, and courage, the kind born from survival, not luxury. Each bite carried the taste of the land, wild and honest as the people who cooked it. For visitors, it was daring. For locals, it was life. Possum and sweet potatoes told the story of mountain living, rough, resourceful, and full of heart. It was food that asked nothing fancy, only respect for what was given and gratitude for what it provided. Tomato gravy and biscuits turned hardship into comfort with every spoonful. When fresh tomatoes ripened or canned ones were on hand, folks would simmer them down with flour, bacon grease, and milk until they formed a rich, tangy sauce. Ladled over warm biscuits or rice, it became a hearty breakfast or a quick supper. The flavor was both sharp and smooth, the perfect balance of simple ingredients made grand. It was poor man's luxury, bright with color and full of heart. The gravy clung to every bite like it belonged there. Families gathered around it, talking slow, eating slower, grateful for what little they had. Tomato gravy proved that flavor came from care, not cost, and that the right recipe could lift spirits no matter the season. It was mountain ingenuity at its finest, homemade, humble, and full of soul. Venison stew with root vegetables was the kind of meal that made a long winter seem shorter. Hunters would bring home venison from the woods, a prize that stretched through the week when cooked right. The meat was browned slow, then left to simmer for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and thick. The smell filled every corner of the cabin, carrying the promise of warmth and rest after a hard day's work. Venison had a deep flavor that no store-bought cut could match, wild and honest like the hills themselves. Every bite was hearty enough to chase off the chill of mountain nights. It was not just food, it was gratitude, a reminder that skill and patience could turn the wilderness into supper. Families gathered close around the table, steam rising from their bowls, and silence replaced talk as the first spoonfuls hit the tongue. This stew was more than survival. It was tradition simmered slow, memory served warm, and pride eaten clean to the last bite. Kushaw squash casserole was the pride of the garden before boxed meals and frozen casseroles ever came along. The long green and white Kushaw squash was peeled, cubed, and boiled until tender, then baked with milk, butter, and a touch of sugar to draw out its natural sweetness. Its mild flavor made it the perfect base for stretching a meal or feeding unexpected guests. Every household had its own version. Some topped it with breadcrumbs, others poured in cream if they were feeling fancy. The smell of baked Kushaw filled the kitchen with comfort, its soft texture melting into every forkful. It was the taste of late summer, of harvests and hard work rewarded. Hill families treated it like gold because it was both filling and forgiving, growing strong even when the soil was poor. No one ever left hungry when Kushaw casserole sat on the table. It was a dish that carried the spirit of mountain thrift, simple, slow, and made from what the land gave freely. To many, it was not just supper, but a symbol of plenty earned the honest way. Corn fritters with sorghum syrup were the kind of treat that made even the hardest days end on a sweet note. Fresh corn was grated right off the cob, mixed with egg and cornmeal, then dropped into hot grease until puffed and golden. Each fritter sizzled with that unmistakable sound of something good cooking. You could eat them plain with a pinch of salt, or drizzle them with dark, sticky sorghum syrup for a dessert that tasted like sunshine and soil. The syrup itself was a treasure, boiled down slow from cane juice, thick as honey and twice as rich. It was poured with care because every drop was earned through long days of turning the mill. Corn fritters were a fair reward for that labor, shared hot from the pan between laughter and stories. Their crisp edges and soft centers made them perfect for breakfast or supper alike. It was the kind of food that did not need a recipe. just memory and feeling, passed down from one careful cook to another. Simple, honest, and always satisfying. Beans and chow chow relish proved that flavor did not have to cost a thing. A pot of brown beans simmered all afternoon, thickening with onions, bacon grease, and a little salt until it was pure comfort in a bowl. What made it special, though, was the chow chow, a relish made from chopped cabbage, peppers, and green tomatoes, pickled in vinegar and sugar. That tangy crunch on top of the soft beans made the whole dish come alive. It was the mountain version of balance, sweet meeting savory in every bite. Folks canned chow chow in big batches, lining up jars on the porch to cool in autumn air. It stretched plain food through the winter and turned even the simplest meal into something bright. Beans and chow chow were everyday fare, but no one ever got tired of them. It was the kind of humble magic only country kitchens knew how to make. Together they showed that good food is not about plenty, it is about knowing what to do with little and doing it well. Hogmaw and potatoes was one of those meals that proved nothing went to waste in a true hillbilly kitchen. The pig's stomach, cleaned and stuffed with diced potatoes, onions, and spices, was baked slow until the filling turned soft and savory. It was not a dish for the faint of heart, but for those who understood the value of every part of the animal, it was a delicacy. The skin crisped at the edges, sealing in the flavor of the simple stuffing inside. What others might have thrown away, mountain families turned into supper. The smell that filled the house was rich, earthy, and unforgettable. Plates were cleaned, not because of hunger alone, but out of respect for the effort behind it. Hogmaw and potatoes taught a lesson about gratitude and grit. That waste was a luxury poor folks could never afford. It was born from necessity but perfected through pride. For those who grew up with it, no feast ever tasted quite as real. Wild greens and cornmeal dumplings were a springtime blessing after long winters of canned food and dried beans. Women and children took to the hills with baskets, picking pokeweed, dandelion, and mustard greens before they grew too bitter. Back home, the greens were boiled in salted water, then simmered in broth with dollops of soft cornmeal batter dropped right in. The dumplings puffed and thickened the pot, turning humble greens into a full meal. A bit of pork grease or smoked bone added the richness that money could not buy. This dish was as much about gathering as eating. It brought people together, walking the ridges and swapping stories. Each bite tasted like earth waking up again, a reminder that the hills still provided if you knew where to look. It was frugal food made with heart, filling bellies while keeping traditions alive. In every spoonful was the flavor of the land itself, wild, fresh, and honest. Turnip soup with cracklins was a cold-weather favorite that smelled like home the moment it started cooking. The turnips, peeled and diced, simmered alongside their greens in a pot of salty broth until tender. Then came the cracklins, crispy bits of pork rind saved from rendering lard, added for texture and flavor. The combination of smoky, crunchy pork and soft, peppery vegetables made every spoonful feel like a reward for the day's work. This soup did not pretend to be fancy, but it filled you up and warmed you through. It was the kind of dish that made neighbors linger at the table long after the bowls were empty. For families scraping by, turnip soup was proof that the simplest ingredients could still feel like a feast. The scent of it cooking on the stove told everyone that supper was near, and all was well. It was humble, hearty, and exactly what the hills were made of. Fried catfish with hush puppies was a supper that tasted like the river itself. Fishermen brought home catfish from muddy banks, cleaning and breading them in cornmeal before frying them crisp in hot grease. The fillets sizzled golden, their flaky flesh tender beneath the crust. Alongside came hush puppies, little cornmeal balls fried in the same skillet, crunchy on the outside and soft inside. A few onion slices and a drizzle of vinegar finished the plate. This was food for Fridays, for family gatherings, for long days rewarded by full bellies. It carried the sound of crickets and the smell of the water, the feeling of summer nights on the porch. Fried catfish was not just a meal, it was a memory that tasted like laughter, hard work, and still water. In every bite, there was pride in what was caught cooked and shared without waste. It was country living at its most honest, simple, and complete. Cabbage and sausage skillet dinners were the kind that kept a family full without emptying the pantry. Smoked sausage, sliced thin, went into a hot skillet first, its fat sizzling and coating the pan. Then came chopped cabbage and diced potatoes, fried together until soft and browned at the edges. The flavors mingled, smoky and sweet, simple and satisfying. It was the perfect end to a long workday, cooked in one pan and shared straight from it. You could smell it from the porch, and it always brought folks running. The sausage might be cheap, the cabbage humble, but together they made a dinner that felt whole. Hill families loved it for being fast, filling, and made from whatever was left in the kitchen. It was comfort food that never needed explaining, a reminder that good flavor comes from care, not cost. When the skillet was empty, there was always a little left in the heart. Sorghum molasses glazed biscuits were a sweet finish to long days that started before sunrise. Biscuits came out of the oven soft, golden, and steaming, ready for a brush of dark, sticky sorghum molasses. The syrup melted right into the crumb, leaving each bite sweet and rich without being heavy. Sorghum was a treasure of its own, grown, pressed, and boiled by hand in the fall, a slow process that turned cane into liquid gold. A jar of it on the table meant hard work had paid off. These biscuits were dessert, breakfast, and comfort all at once. You did not need butter or fancy toppings, just a drizzle of sorghum and a quiet moment. In the mountains, sweetness came from effort, not ease. Each biscuit carried that truth, warm as a hug from someone who loved you. Simple, sticky, and soul-deep. They ended the day the way mountain folks liked best, grateful, full, and smiling. Homestead potato hash turned scraps and simple staples into a skillet full of comfort and sustenance. Settlers diced leftover smoked meat, onions, and hearty potatoes, frying everything together in hot cast iron until the edges crisped and the flavors blended into one savory bite. Early risers loved the way the scent of onions and sizzling pork filled the cold morning air, promising warmth and strength for long hours of labor. Sometimes wild herbs or a handful of garden peppers were tossed in for color and heat, but the beauty of this hash lay in its flexibility. It stretched scarce supplies, used every scrap, and satisfied appetites after hunting trips or timber work. Children often hovered near the stove, hoping for the crunchy bits at the bottom of the pan. Though modern diners may call it brunch fare, the original Homestead version was a lifeline, a meal that proved how creativity and careful use of leftovers could turn the humblest ingredients into something worthy of a family gathering after a hard day. Corn dodgers were a humble food that carried workers through long days in the fields or on the road. Made from cornmeal, salt, and water, sometimes enriched with lard, the dough was shaped into small cakes and fried or baked. They were sturdy, portable, and filling, making them perfect for laborers who needed food that could travel. Families packed them into lunch pails, and soldiers carried them during the Civil War, keeping the tradition alive for generations. Corn dodgers were often eaten plain, but sometimes dipped in molasses or gravy if available. They symbolized a kind of practical cooking where function mattered more than luxury. Though simple, they were tied to the rhythms of work, hunger, and endurance. Today, corn dodgers are rarely seen outside of history books or reenactments, forgotten in favor of softer breads and convenience foods. Yet their story reminds us how much people relied on ingenuity to make basic grains stretch. Corn dodgers were never glamorous, but they were dependable. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes captured the warmth of the hearth in a method older than most family recipes. Grandmothers nestled whole sweet potatoes directly into the glowing embers of a wood fireplace, letting the natural sugars slowly caramelize under the blackened skin. The potatoes emerged tender and smoky, their soft orange flesh carrying a depth of flavor that no modern oven could quite match. Children gathered near the fire, eager for the moment when the potatoes were lifted out with long tongs and wrapped in clean cloths to cool just enough for holding. A simple sprinkle of salt or a pat of fresh butter was all that was needed to turn the humble root into a winter night feast. The process required patience, but little else, making it a perfect example of turning necessity into comfort. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes evoke evenings filled with crackling firelight, family stories, and the quiet satisfaction of food cooked by the heart and by the hearth itself. Creamed pearl tapioca was a dish that confused most people the first time they saw it, but it had a quiet charm that stuck. Grandma would cook the tiny pearls slowly until they turned translucent and soft, then fold them into a thick, savory base with cheese, onions, or even bits of ham or mushrooms. It was like a casserole crossed with a pudding. Strange, but comforting. The texture was warm and creamy, with a soft bite that held everything together. You would not find it on many dinner tables today, but back then, it was a way to stretch ingredients and use up pantry staples in unexpected ways. It was often baked until the top turned golden and set, then scooped onto the plate beside a roast or served in ramekins for something a little more refined. It had a richness that felt out of place for how inexpensive it was to make. Most people remember tapioca as a sweet dessert, but this version belonged to the savory world, and it was a world all its own. Macaroni and tomatoes was the forgotten side that kept dinner plates full when grocery budgets were stretched thin. You would boil macaroni, toss it with stewed tomatoes, a pat of butter, and maybe onions or cheese if you had extra. It was not glamorous, but it got the job done. You could find this simple pasta side in old community cookbooks from the 40s through the 70s, tucked between casserole recipes and Jell-O molds. Families loved it because it used pantry staples, cost little, and made meals stretch farther. It showed up next to pork chops, meatloaf, or whatever leftovers you had. Macaroni and tomatoes was the quiet hero of the table, filling bellies when money was tight. You do not see it much now, but in its day, it was a practical filling side that showed how far folks could go with a box of pasta and a can of tomatoes. Ash-roasted potatoes proved that even the simplest ingredient could taste extraordinary when cooked in the heart of a fire. Whole potatoes, scrubbed clean of dirt, were wrapped in damp cloth or left bare and buried beneath glowing embers. The ashes sealed in heat and smoky aroma, while the skins blackened and the insides turned soft and creamy. After hours of slow roasting, mountain men raked the potatoes from the coals, brushing away soot to reveal steaming, fragrant flesh. A pinch of salt or a pat of butter transformed the humble tuber into a meal that felt almost luxurious after days of hard travel. The skin carried a subtle crunch, while the interior held the essence of wood smoke and earth, a reminder of the land that provided it. Gathered around the dying fire, companions shared the potatoes with quiet appreciation, knowing that such simple food could keep spirits high and bodies strong. Few modern campfire dishes match the pure satisfaction of ash-roasted potatoes eaten under a starlit mountain sky. Corn pone was a dish tied directly to survival. A cornbread stripped of luxury and made with nothing but cornmeal, water, and salt. Unlike cornbread enriched with milk, eggs, or sugar, corn pone was dense, chewy, and often cooked in a skillet or even on hot stones near a fire. It was the food of farmers, laborers, and families with little more than a sack of cornmeal to last the week. Despite its simplicity, corn pone carried dignity because it kept people alive during lean years. It was eaten plain, with beans, or crumbled into milk or pot liquor for extra nourishment. Children grew up on it, and older generations remembered it as a symbol of persistence when choices were scarce. Though not glamorous, it filled stomachs and carried people through desperate times. As prosperity grew, corn pone was replaced by softer, sweeter breads, leaving it nearly forgotten. Yet its legacy remains in the memory of grandparents who knew its importance. Corn pone tells the story of survival through simplicity, a dish that gave strength when little else could. Parched corn snack was a pocket-sized taste of Southern thrift and tradition, perfect for long afternoons on the porch or walks through the fields. Dried corn kernels were slowly pan-toasted in a heavy iron skillet until each kernel puffed slightly and released a warm, nutty aroma. Grandmothers stirred the corn constantly to keep it from scorching, seasoning it only with a pinch of salt once the toasting was complete. The result was a crunchy snack that kept well in jars and traveled easily in pockets or small sacks, making it a favorite for children exploring woods and streams. It carried the sweet, earthy flavor of the harvest in every bite and required no sugar or fancy additions to satisfy. Families often made large batches after the corn harvest to enjoy through the winter months. Parched corn snack remains a simple reminder of times when the land provided both food and entertainment, and when the careful hand of a grandmother could transform plain grain into something worth remembering. Spinach timbales were a dish that made vegetables feel like something grand. Grandma would mix cooked spinach with eggs, cream, and a handful of breadcrumbs, pour the mixture into small molds, and bake them until they puffed and set. The result was a delicate custard-like mound that held its shape and tasted rich and savory. It looked fancy, but was often made from leftovers or frozen spinach, which made it even more impressive. These little timballs were served warm with a drizzle of cheese sauce or gravy and were a regular part of dinner parties or special Sunday meals. They had that old-fashioned air of formality that came from caring about presentation, even when money was tight. Spinach timballies were quiet showstoppers, the kind of dish that made people stop and take note without saying a word. They are rarely seen today outside of vintage cookbooks or culinary schools, but for a time they were proof that vegetables could be elegant too. Maybe we would all eat more greens if they were served like this again. Hunter's acorn bread turned forest harvests into a hearty loaf when store-bought flour was nothing more than a dream. Foragers gathered fallen acorns beneath towering oaks, cracking each nut to remove the bitter skins. The meat was ground and repeatedly soaked in cold stream water to leach away tannins until it became a mild, nutty meal. Mixed with a little salt, wild honey if available, and just enough water to bind, the dough was pressed into cast-iron pans and baked beside glowing coals. The result was a dense, dark bread with a deep, woodsy flavor and surprising sweetness, strong enough to sustain hunters through long days on the trail. Children helped shell the acorns, their fingers stained brown while stories of past harvests filled the clearing. Every bite carried the taste of the forest floor and the reward of patient work. Today, acorn flour is a novelty, but for mountain men and homesteaders, it was a dependable staple that celebrated the generous spirit of the trees and the endurance of those who gathered beneath them. Poke salad greens were a classic example of Depression-era foraging turned into food tradition, though they required care and skill. Pokeweed grows wild across the South, and its young leaves were harvested, boiled, and drained several times to remove natural toxins. Once prepared safely, the greens were fried with bacon fat or mixed into stews, providing a much-needed source of vitamins. For poor rural families, poke salad represented survival, turning something free and wild into a filling side dish. It was not glamorous, but it carried the pride of resourcefulness in desperate times. Poke salad suppers even became community events in some areas, celebrating a food that was both humble and dangerous if mishandled. Children grew up knowing that only the young leaves were safe to eat, while older parts of the plant were poisonous. Today, few people bother with the time or risk, leaving poke salad largely forgotten except in folklore. It remains a powerful reminder of how closely people once lived with the land. Boiled peanut and rice croquettes combined coastal Carolina flavors into a quick dish that brought the harvest of field and water to one plate. Grandmothers boiled green peanuts until tender, then ground them with cooked rice and a sprinkle of herbs to form a rich, nutty mixture. Small portions were shaped into balls and pan-fried until crisp and golden, creating a crunchy shell around a soft, flavorful center. The earthy peanuts paired beautifully with the mild rice, offering a satisfying snack or side dish that reflected both ingenuity and local abundance. These croquettes were perfect for gatherings when guests arrived unexpectedly because the ingredients were simple and the cooking time short. Children loved their bite-sized shape, while adults enjoyed the unique blend of flavors rarely found beyond the Carolina coast. Boiled peanut and rice croquettes showcased the creative ways Southern grandmothers honored regional crops and proved that a humble pairing could become something special with just a hot pan and skilled hands. Jellied cabbage salad might sound like a dare today, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was a dish of pride. This was not some jiggly dessert. This was savory gelatin, made with cabbage, carrots, vinegar, and sometimes a hint of onion or celery. The gelatin was clear and firm, often made with tomato or lemon juice instead of just water. The vegetables were suspended in it like little windows into the garden. It was served cold, sliced into neat squares, and always had a place at the table during luncheons or church dinners. Some versions were topped with mayonnaise or set into ring molds with a little lettuce garnish in the center. You had to have grown up with it to understand why it mattered. It was refreshing, texturally strange, but oddly satisfying. Today, we turn our noses up at savory gelatin, but back then, it was a sign of effort and hospitality, a dish that took time, not shortcuts. Maybe it is time we looked at those odd recipes again, with curiosity instead of judgment. Corn pudding casserole was the side dish that made even the humblest dinner plate feel warm and complete. If you flipped through old recipe cards tucked behind flour jars, chances are this one was written in your grandmother's handwriting. It combined sweet corn, butter, eggs, and milk into a creamy bake that sat proudly next to roast ham or pork chops. It was easy, affordable, and filled bellies, making it a go-to for potlucks, church suppers, and holidays. The top baked up golden brown, the inside stayed soft and rich, and every bite reminded you how folks pulled meals together from what they had. Corn pudding casserole carried meals through tough times, earning its place in kitchens from the Depression to the 70s. You do not see it much now, but back then, that creamy baked corn meant comfort on a plate. Moose meatloaf turned the grand harvest of the northern woods into a humble yet deeply satisfying family supper. Hunters ground coarse cuts of moose with hand-cranked grinders, mixing the lean meat with breadcrumbs, eggs if they had them, and wild herbs gathered along the trail. Packed into heavy iron pans, the loaf baked beside a wood stove or campfire until its savory aroma filled the cabin. The moose's natural richness created a flavor far deeper than beef, while the slow baking kept the meat tender and moist despite the lean texture. Families sliced thick slabs to serve with root vegetables or simply on coarse bread for hearty sandwiches the next morning. In regions where moose ranged freely, this dish marked a successful hunt and promised full stomachs for days. Today it is rare to see moose on any menu, but the memory of a golden brown loaf steaming on a rough-hewn table lives on as a symbol of skill, gratitude, and the rugged abundance of a life close to the land. Ambrosia. Salad with fresh coconut was not the quick throw-together dish we see at modern potlucks, but a true labor of love. Families grated fresh coconut by hand, a time-consuming process that often required a special tool or sheer determination. Oranges were peeled and sectioned, sometimes layered with pineapple, sugar, and the freshly grated coconut in glass bowls that sparkled with color. This dish often appeared during the holidays, especially Christmas, when citrus fruits were abundant and coconuts became available in markets. Children looked forward to the sweetness, while adults valued its symbolism of abundance in lean times. Ambrosia meant more than fruit salad. It was a ritual that tied families together through both labor and enjoyment. Every bite reflected the season's generosity, even if resources were otherwise tight. Modern versions made with canned fruit and bagged coconut lack the painstaking care of the original. Forgotten by many, the old-fashioned version reminds us of a time when effort in the kitchen was an act of devotion and celebration. Its disappearance is not just about food, but about lost traditions of gathering and gratitude. Muscadine skillet cobbler celebrated the thick-skinned wild grapes that ripened late in southern summers, filling the air with their musky perfume. Grandmothers simmered the grapes with sugar until the juices turned deep purple, then poured the bubbling fruit into a cast-iron skillet lined with a simple cornmeal batter. As it baked, the batter rose through the grapes, creating golden pockets that soaked up the sweet syrup. The cobbler emerged fragrant and richly colored, a dessert that captured the fleeting taste of the wild vines. Families often picked the grapes together, braving tangled thickets for the reward of a warm evening treat. Served with fresh cream or enjoyed plain, each spoonful offered a burst of tart sweetness and the satisfaction of food gathered by hand. Muscadine skillet cobbler remains a reminder of late summer nights, family foraging trips, and the joy of transforming wild fruit into a rustic masterpiece that could never be replicated with store-bought grapes. Glazed turnips were one of Grandma's ways of making stubborn vegetables taste like something worth getting seconds of. She would peel and cube them, then simmer them in a pan with butter, sugar, and a splash of broth or vinegar until they were soft and glossy. The natural bitterness of the turnip mellowed into something sweet and earthy, with a flavor that felt oddly fancy for such a humble root. Glazed turnips were often served beside roasts or ham, especially when the fancier vegetables were too expensive or out of season. It was the kind of dish that showed up quietly, then disappeared just as quietly. No fuss, no leftovers. A lot of kids wrinkled their noses at first, but ended up going back for more. You almost never hear about this recipe now, not even in family newsletters or holiday cookbooks. But there was a time when turnips had their moment, and Grandma made sure of it. It was not about turning vegetables into something they were not. It was about bringing out the best in what you had. Hominy casserole bake was one of those hearty, dependable sides that quietly held Southern kitchens together, especially when every meal had to count. You would take cooked hominy, mix it with shredded cheese, a little cream, top it with breadcrumbs, and bake it until bubbling and golden. It was simple, filling, and made sure nothing went to waste. Hominy casserole bake showed up at church suppers, family reunions, and holidays, especially in rural areas where pantry staples had to stretch. It might sound old-fashioned now, but this cheesy casserole was pure comfort on a plate, adding a little richness to meals built around fried meats, barbecue, or stews. You would find it in vintage cookbooks, passed down from neighbors or scribbled on recipe cards with curled edges. It has mostly slipped off dinner tables today, but back then it turned humble ingredients into something worth gathering around. Families leaned on simple dishes like this to bring warmth to the table without spending much. It filled bellies and brought people together, reminding everyone how far frugal, clever cooking could go. Rabbit and dumplings gave mountain families a way to stretch scarce protein into a feast when resources ran low. Hunters snared or shot cottontail rabbits, cleaned them swiftly, and browned the pieces in a seasoned pot. Water, onions, and wild herbs turned the meat into a savory broth that simmered for hours until every bone released its flavor. Simple dumplings of flour, fat, and cold water were pinched into the pot, where they puffed and softened, soaking up the rich stock. The meal offered nourishment and warmth after long days of trapping or woodcutting, its aroma filling cabins with a promise of comfort. Children eagerly waited for the first ladleful, while elders shared quiet stories of endurance and respect for the game that fed them. Today's store-bought meat and ready-made soups have replaced such deliberate preparation, but the memory of rabbit and dumplings lingers as a reminder of how patience, skill, and gratitude once turned a modest catch into a sustaining mountain supper shared with love. Sorghum molasses. Stack cake was more than a dessert. It was a centerpiece of Appalachian weddings and celebrations. Families in the mountains could not afford elaborate tiered cakes, so they created this dish by stacking thin layers of cake, often baked by different neighbors, with a filling made of sorghum molasses and stewed apples. The result was a dense, sweet cake that grew moister and more flavorful the longer it rested. Sorghum molasses, cheaper than sugar, added depth and a rustic sweetness unique to the region. Each layer symbolized the contribution of family and community, turning the cake into more than food. It was a collective expression of joy. Though once beloved, it faded as refined sugar and store-bought cakes became accessible, leaving stack cakes as a fading memory. Today, they survive mostly in regional cookbooks or heritage festivals, rarely baked in modern kitchens. Yet the sorghum molasses stack cake endures in memory as proof of how Southern cooks transformed scarcity into celebration. Its absence today is not just the loss of a recipe, but the fading of a cultural ritual of sharing and resilience. Cottage cheese salad was the quiet hero of mid-century potlucks and family suppers, even if no one talks about it much anymore. You would start with a scoop of plain cottage cheese, soft, tangy, and mild. Then fold in fruit like pineapple, sliced peaches, or even chopped tomatoes depending on the occasion. Some versions leaned sweet with whipped cream or gelatin. Others stayed savory with cucumbers or chives. Either way, it was a refreshing, creamy dish that needed no cooking and very little prep. It was served chilled on a lettuce leaf or in a glass bowl, the kind that caught the sunlight just right. It might not have turned heads, but it always got eaten. Cottage cheese salad was something you made when you wanted to offer something light, simple, and just a little different. It was affordable, nutritious, and versatile, ideal for hot summers or holiday tables alike. Today, it has all but vanished, replaced by packaged sides or dressed-up grain salads. But those who remember it know how comforting that cool, creamy bite could be. Sometimes the quietest dishes are the hardest to forget. Cornflake-topped vegetable medley was the crunchy, thrifty side dish that showed up at potlucks and family dinners, straight from those old spiral-bound cookbooks. You would take canned or frozen vegetables, stir them with cream sauce, pour it into a casserole dish, and finish it with a layer of crushed cornflakes before baking. It sounds unusual now, but back then, this topping was genius. It added crunch, stretched ingredients, and turned plain vegetables into something hearty. Cornflake-topped vegetable medley earned its spot at the table because it made basic produce feel dressed up enough for guests or holidays. It sat proudly next to meatloaf, roast turkey, or ham, offering crispy contrast to heavier mains. Families loved it for how easy it was to throw together, how well it traveled to potlucks, and how much kids liked the crunchy topping. You hardly see it now, but back then, that golden cornflake crust meant you brought your best, even when groceries were tight. It proved simple ingredients could still make a meal feel special and complete. Pioneer whole beans brought deep smoky richness to camps where slow cooking was a necessity and not a luxury. Cooks dug a pit in the earth and lined it with river stones heated in a roaring fire until they glowed red. A heavy pot filled with soaked beans, molasses, onions, and chunks of salt pork was placed inside, covered with more stones and earth, and left to bake overnight. Through the dark hours, the beans absorbed the heat and the scent of wood smoke, transforming into a dish of sweet and savory depth that greeted the dawn with irresistible aroma. Travelers would rise to the hiss of opening earth and the sight of steam lifting into the morning air. Served with rough bread or eaten straight from tin bowls, these beans nourished weary bodies after long days of hauling traps or splitting logs. The slow patience required feels foreign today, yet those who have tasted whole beans remember a flavor that no modern oven or stovetop can quite recreate. Sally Lunn bread was once the pride of many Southern kitchens, a golden loaf that balanced richness with simplicity. Unlike the quick cornbreads and biscuits that defined everyday suppers, this bread required patience. It was made with yeast, giving it a lofty rise and tender crumb, but it also had a subtle sweetness that came from sugar and butter folded into the dough. Families often reserved Sally Lunn for Sundays, holidays, or company because it demanded time and attention that could not always be spared during the Depression or lean years. The bread was baked in heavy pans, often cast iron, which gave it a crisp crust that contrasted with its soft interior. Its popularity stretched from Virginia to Kentucky, where it appeared at breakfast, sliced and spread with butter or sorghum molasses, and at dinner, served beside roasted meats. Today, it has nearly disappeared from tables, overshadowed by easier breads that require less effort. Yet Sally Lunn bread remains a reminder of how Southern cooks elevated simple ingredients into something elegant, transforming flour, eggs, and yeast into a loaf that symbolized hospitality and care. Elk chili filled the high country air with a spice that warmed even the coldest night. Hunters prized elk for its lean yet deeply flavored meat, cubing it into hearty chunks before browning them with onions in heavy cast-iron pots. Dried chilies ground by hand released their smoky heat as they simmered with the meat, beans, and a ladle of mountain spring water. The mixture cooked slowly until the elk turned tender and the broth thickened into a bold, fiery stew. Camps smelled of pepper and pine as the chili bubbled, drawing weary travelers closer to the flames. A piece of hard bread or a handful of roasted corn often served as the only accompaniment. yet the chili satisfied every hunger. Each pot told a story of patience and strength, of hunters who respected the animal and used every part with gratitude. Modern chili packets and quick sauces cannot capture the deep, rugged flavor that came from real elk and long hours over an open fire in the quiet wilderness. Got a favorite hillbilly dinner your grandparents made? Drop it in the comments, give that like button a good smack, and subscribe for more down-home memories served hot.